First of all, I would like to thank everyone who has watched the series so far. This is the final installment. It is probably clear I am new to YouTube and am still learning the ins and outs of video creating, but I hope to consistently improve as I create more videos. I started this series after seeing a reluctance amongst many followers on my Instagram to read this article I have narrated despite it being key to understanding the hypothesis I have been trying to explain. This was all understandable as it is quite a lengthy read and is not what most people log on to Instagram to be reading. I myself have always found it easier to listen to a YouTube video as though it were an audiobook rather than read an extensive article or book. I had not seen any other channels discuss this topic and so thought I may as well get this theory onto this platform for people to make of it what they will. Future videos on this channel will discuss the potential flaws or holes in the argument, but for now it's just my job to narrate his highly well thought out article to the wider world. Without further ado, here is the final section of his blog post that discusses the bigger picture of his theory. You can find the original article linked in the description. Section 3. The big picture. The devil is in the details, they say, so we've first gone through the most important ones of each area. Now it's time to step back and look at the big picture. Notice that the above map is not intended to be accurate in the details, but just to give a broad approximation. For the steppe populations, the dotted areas represent where they were alongside local populations, while the solid area is where they were the only population living in that huge area and speaking their native language. The Proto-Indo European homeland. From all of what we've commented so far, as well as from the map above, it may be clear to anyone that's gotten this far that the Proto-Indo European homeland must be placed in North Iran and Turan. The two main factors that make it necessary to place it there are the presence of Indo-European languages in India and the Tocharian language in Xinjiang. From further west, those two things would be too difficult to explain. The origin of the language must have been in the South Caspian area, from where it went with the Neolithic to Turan. These areas must have spoken pre-Indo-European from the early Neolithic. Proto-Indo-European would be the phase prior to its expansion outside of that homeland, which would be close to 4500 BC. We lack ancient DNA from India to know the date or arrival of the population that formed the North Indian one, but certain anthropological studies suggest that there was a change around 4500 BC. And from the samples that we have from later dates, we know that North Indians can be modeled as a mixture of populations from Turan and ASI. What we don't really know is if this possible migration to India meant a split in the Pro-Indo-Indo-European language or it stayed as a language continuum due to the continuous contacts. Regardless of the level of divergence that may have existed, it was later erased with Proto-Indo-Iranian because of their common language in the 3rd millennium BC. The first known split, then, should be the one that led to the Anatolian branch, which as mentioned before, must have happened when people from North Iran moved to the South Caucasus circa 4200 BC, though the divergence didn't happen in the South Caucasus, where it stayed close to the core area, but rather when the language went from the South Caucasus to Anatolia, somewhere around 4000 to 3500 BC. It must have been in the southern parts of Anatolia, where the language stayed more isolated from the rest and diverged from the other branches. The next split had to be the one that led to Tocharian, and for this we'll have to look a bit closer at the Inner Asian Mountain Corridor. The Inner Asia Mountain Corridor. This corridor at the eastern edge of Central Asia had a native population that was genetically what has been called Ancient North Eurasian. This genetic profile was also found throughout Siberia in the Paleolithic and forms part of the Native American populations. In its pure form, it survived from the South Urals to the Altai and through this Inner Asian Mountain Corridor well into the Holocene. We have a Mesolithic sample from the site of Tutkal dated to around 6200 BC, a time corresponding with the Hisar culture, which probably started to have contacts with the Neolithic neighboring regions and eventually led to this population of the Inner Asian Mountain Corridor to adopt pastoralism during the 6th millennium BC. We have evidence that this population was moving between Central Asia and China, since they've been found to have seeds that originate from both places. See, for example, Frachetti et al. 2014. Some indirect evidence comes too from faunal remains in Inner Mongolia, where domestic sheep of the West Asian type has been found and was probably there since the mid-5th millennium BC. In the Altai, we have the earliest evidence from seeds too dating to the end of the 4th millennium BC, though it's probable that they were there since earlier. What the evidence suggests is that this population adopted an Indo-European language from their southern neighbors at an early date, probably before 4000 BC. It may have been around 3500 to 3000 BC when part of this population settled in a more permanent way in Xinjiang, what led to the partial isolation of their language, which would evolve into Tocharian, while those who stayed along the Inner Asian Mountain Corridor would have continued to evolve their language in conjunction with that of Turan, becoming speakers of Proto-Indo-Iranian when it became the language of BMA. From a genetic point of view, we can look at a few samples that would support this idea. A sample from the site of Dali, part of the Inner Asian mountain corridor, dated to 2700 BC, already shows some admixture from both the southern neighbors of Turan and from the steppe population that arrived to the Altai region circa 3000 BC of Afanasyevo, which shows how these people were moving along that Inner Asian mountain corridor from the north to the south. However, samples from a later date, ca. 2000 to 1800 BC, from the Tarim Basin in Xinjiang, shows them to be unadmixed, suggesting a larger degree of isolation from before the date of the Dali sample. Archaeological and genetic evidence provide already good evidence on which to base the idea that Tocharian must have come from this population. The idea that Tocharian may have come from the Afanasyevo people lacks both types of evidence. For example, while it also avoids the linguistic problems that were always found in the alternative Afanasyevo hypothesis. The importance of this population when it comes to the spread of Indo European languages doesn't end there, since, as we've seen before, they may have been the first ones responsible for introducing the Indo Iranian language to the steppe people around the eastern Altai region, where their influence is visible in the Fedorovo burial rites. Back to Europe. We've seen so far a probable way in which Indo European languages must have reached Southeast Europe, but now we'll have a look at how they spread to the rest of Europe. The details are still fuzzy, and it's not too important for the purpose of this post. While the steppe hypothesis required a more detailed explanation, given that not much else other than the languages would have come from the steppe. Obviously, the discovery that the people of most of Europe came from the steppe gave the theory a perfect basis. It's just that the time and places of their expansions does not match with those of the Indo European languages, and that's now its main problem. When it comes to something going from West Asia to Southeast Europe and then spreading to the rest of Europe, there's nothing controversial about it. Basically, everything came from West Asia to Southeast Europe and then spread throughout the continent, whether it was farming, any innovations like working ink in its different varieties, writing systems, coinage, civilizations themselves, or even Christianity. That's just the natural way things went in ancient Europe. We first have to look at the possibilities of how did Indo-European languages spread throughout the Balkans. We've provided a credible scenario for Greek, but is that scenario valid for the rest of the Balkans? Let's look at this problematic question. The first solution would be that it was the cultural package from Thrace and Greece was largely responsible for spreading the Indo-European language throughout the Balkans, since outside Bulgaria and Greece, there doesn't seem to be any West Asian ancestry between 2000 to 1500 BC, which would be the time when we'd need Indo-European languages to have spread throughout the Balkans. In any case, let's take the chance to have a closer look at the population dynamics that took place in the Balkans during the Bronze Age, which will also show the big difference with Northern and Eastern Europe. We have just enough samples from Bulgaria to show this process. People from the steppe started to move to the Balkans circa 3200 BC, and this is how steppe communities from Bulgaria circa 3000 to 2800 BC looked like. And here are contemporary local communities from that early period. As can be seen, there's a stark difference between them, with the steppe communities having very little admixture from locals, and local communities having very little admixture from the steppe ones. After a few centuries, this is how a steppe community would look like, and how a local community looked like after a few centuries too. The steppe community had only 1/3 of its ancestry left, while the local community had some 10% admixture from the steppe. By the time the communities finished admixing, this is how they looked like. Once the communities from both sides fused, their paternal and maternal lineages should more or less correspond with the amount of admixture contributed by each community. For example, in the samples above, there are 6 males. 5 of them have local paternal lineages, and 1 has a steppe paternal lineage. In the Western Balkans, it seems like steppe communities represented a higher percentage of the population, since we see from 2000 BC, and later some 30% steppe in the mixed communities, with paternal and maternal lineages from the steppe also being at around that level. Here are some late Bronze Age from Montenegro, clearly more steppe admixture and no West Asian admixture. To reiterate what was said in the first part of this post, the sort of evidence shown here is the one that we lack from Northern and Western Europe. Not because we lack samples, but because at the time the steppe communities started to arrive, the Neolithic ones were mostly gone, and where they still lived, it was just long enough for the steppe communities to take females from them before they died out. So not only we lack direct evidence of any of those few communities that survived until the arrival of the steppe, we also can't show how a fused community between steppe and local would look like after several centuries, because such thing never happened. There were no mixed communities. The only ones that existed were the ones from the steppe, with 100% of the paternal lineages being from the steppe. Back to the problem about the Balkans. We need the Indo-European languages to be all over the Balkans by 1500 BC or shortly after, but we don't have any clear evidence of how this may have happened. Genetics don't give us any solution, so only archaeology can help here. The spread of Indo European languages had to have been mostly a cultural transmission, but I will leave this for people with more expertise in the archaeology of the Balkans, and meanwhile offer a possible alternative to this cultural transmission. We could speculate that the Yamnaya people had already shifted to an Indo European language from the Caucasus in the period from 3500 to 3300 BC, i.e., after the quoted Ware Horizon people had separated, and probably Afanasyevo too. A language transfer across the Caucasus is much more possible during this Makop Novo-Svobodnaya phase than anything related to the preceding Darkbeti Meshoko period. And the language transfer would go the natural way from the more settled, higher culture society to the more mobile, pastoralist one. In this scenario, Yamnaya would have spread the ancestor of Italo-Celtic, Germanic, and pre-Balto-Slavic to the Balkans before being replaced in the steppe by the Srubnaya culture, ca 1800 BC, which would have brought a non-Indo European language again until the arrival of the Scythians. However, while having evidence of actual people from the steppe moving around the Balkans seems better than no evidence from West Asian admixed populations, it's still true that they were the minority, lived separated for quite a while from the locals, and didn't have a superior culture that would attract the locals to it, rather the contrary. So it's up to each reader to decide if this scenario does really improve things over the first one, where cultural transmission would be the basic reason for the adoption of Indo-European languages. Lastly, this alternative scenario would be incompatible with Hurrians being from the steppe, so if the latter is confirmed, it would invalidate this possibility. From the Balkans to the rest of Europe, it won't be of much help to get ancient DNA, because people within Europe were already very similar to each other, and it's difficult to detect movements of people from genetics unless we have a very high resolution. From what we know about Celtic or Italic, we shouldn't expect a large amount of people to have been migrating with the languages as they expanded. Following the spread of innovations like iron or war chariots fueled by domestic horses may be a better way to track the spread of Indo-European languages throughout the rest of Europe. War chariots may have already played a role in their spread through the Balkans, at least Greece. I will be very brief about this since the details of it are beyond the scope of this post. For the Balto-Slavic languages, we have some constraints that allow us to know the approximate place and time where they formed, since their formation was strongly influenced by Indo-Iranian language. We know that Indo-Iranian started to be adopted on the steppe at its eastern edge around the Altai region of South Siberia shortly after 2000 BC. These early adopters could be considered Proto-Scythians, and the genesis of the Scythian culture throughout Central Asia would continue till around 1200 BC. At that point, they started to move to the west through the steppe, replacing the preceding Srubnaya culture, which, like the Andronovo culture, was a descendant of the Sintashta culture, but didn't go through the language shift that happened in the Andronovo one, and therefore would have still spoken its original North Eurasian Bronze Age language. The Scythians may have arrived to the western edge of the steppe around 1200 to 1000 BC, which would be the earliest date for starting contacts with Indo-European speakers from the adjacent area in Europe. The population that would become Proto-Balto-Slavic must have already spoken an Indo-European language by then, but in an older centum form. This would mean that Indo-European had already spread by then to the north of the Balkans, as was said earlier to be required. A good candidate, given its time and location for being the culture where Proto-Balto-Slavic formed, would be the Chernol's culture, that started at the end of the 2nd millennium BC and continued until 500 to 200 BC. If these were Herodotus' Scythian plowmen as speculated, it would align very well with this possibility, since we should be looking for a population native to Europe and being sedentary farmers, not nomads, but who shared several cultural traits with the Scythians, which would easily explain the influence in their language too. Notice that dating Proto-Balto-Slavic to around 1000 to 500 BC and to that approximate area is something necessary due to the clear Indo-Iranian influence that cannot be explained in any other way. After that formation period, we'd have the Baltic branch separating around the latter stage and expanding to the north. The details of this are something I've not tried to figure out, and it's not relevant for the purpose of this post. The important thing is that the case of Balto-Slavic formation that can be located and dated with significant accuracy should serve as an example of how Indo-European languages formed and spread to the rest of Europe from the Balkans. Baltic languages dating to around 500 BC, when they started to expand to the north, should also help to put into perspective the age of Indo-European languages in Europe. The details of other language branches should be somehow analogous. Italic and Celtic proto-languages would have formed in the northwestern parts of the Balkans and adjacent areas, with Italic then separating and moving into the Italic peninsula, while Celtic expanded to the west from around the eastern part of the Alps, mostly as always proposed. Germanic is the least clear one, but it should have been a similar process. If we consider that the Chernol's culture was roughly preceded in the area by the eastern part of the Mycenian culture, and that preceding Mycenian culture had already become Indo European, then the western part of it would have become Indo European too, and would already be in the right place and time to be ancestral to Proto Germanic. I'm not specifically proposing that scenario, it's just for the sake of giving an example. Update. Checking the available samples, I noticed we have a good sequence from Czechia from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. Looking at them, I see a significant change between 1600 BC and 1500 BC, approximately coinciding with the end of the Una Tika culture and the beginning of the Tumulus culture. The samples from the Tumulus culture are dated to 1500 to 1250 BC without C14 dating, and there are only 4 of them. But the change is persistent through the late Bronze Age and into the early Iron Age samples from Hallstatt period below. The Bulgaria early Bronze Age samples are a relatively distant source, so the significant 27.5% impact is underestimated. With a more proximate source, the impact is around 40%. Quite a big change in a small period between 2 consecutive cultures. I leave here some references to some interesting papers related to the formation of the Nordic Bronze Age, 1600 BC, and its connections to the Carpathian Basin and ultimately the Aegean world, issues with the steppe hypothesis, an archaeological perspective on iconography, mythology and language in Neolithic and early Bronze Age southern Scandinavia. Rune Iverson, 2024. It is therefore not surprising that Europe and the Aegean during the 15th, 14th centuries BC shared the use of similar efficient warrior swords of the flange-hilted type, as well as select elements of shared lifestyle, such as camp stools. Linked to this are also tools for body care, such as razors and tweezers. This whole Mycenian package, including spiral decoration, was most directly adopted in South Scandinavia after 1500 BC, creating a specific and selective Nordic variety of Mycenaean high culture that was not adopted in the intermediate region. This could hardly have come about without intense communication and practice by traveling warriors or mercenaries. Swords come in different types and have different fighting styles. Therefore, they are not easily adapted. They are part of a system of warfare and skills that demand long-term training. Furthermore, they demand changes in social organization in order to sustain the new role of warriors. It therefore seems likely that warriors were at the same time also traders, or they accompanied traders to protect them. We may therefore accept that the shared use of sword types among Scandinavia, Central Europe, and the Aegean during this period would also lead to similarities in the social institutions linked to warriors. This seems indeed to be the case. The dual organization of leadership between a Wanax and a Lawagitas in the Mycenaean realm is replicated in the Nordic realm, which also copied Mycenaean material culture closely. A suite of linked histories across Europe transpires when attaching importance to the fact that the time period in which it all began, circa 1600 BC, was a turning point on a European scale. The precise timing may be debated, but it is here suggested that the link of change could ultimately have emanated from the early post-eruption Aegean with embryonic Mycenaean hegemonies. While commencing circa 1600 BC, the Nordic Bronze Age, in a manner of speaking, did not come into full fruition until circa 1500-1465 BC in Nordic Bronze Age Phase 2, which is therefore justifiable as the first true highlight of the southern Scandinavian Bronze Age. In Nordic Bronze Age Phase 2, however, the Carpathian connection is no longer culturally visible but rather completely absorbed in the now uniform Nordic Koine. Instead, clearer glimpses of Mycenaean cultural impact occur in Scandinavia. This is now sustained by the testimony of lead isotope analysis. The Aegean seems from 1500 BC directly included in the Nordic sphere of interaction. What's missing and perspectives? There are many details missing in this brief overview, but I want to point out the ones that are technically missing in order to confirm the basics of what I have explained here. Getting samples from North India dating to the early Vedic culture to confirm that they were local people. I'd give this a probability of around 95%. Getting samples from North India dating to the period of 5000 to 4000 BC to see if there was a big change in the population at that time, which could correspond with the arrival of Indo European speakers to the subcontinent. The probability of this, I'll leave it as unknown. Getting samples from early Hurrians to know if they came from the steppe. This one is not too important for Indo European questions. But if Hurrian could be confirmed to be a steppe language, it would be the key to investigate the whole language family. I'd give this 60 to 70% chances of being correct. There are many other samples that we are missing and would help for better knowing all the details, but I've listed the most important ones for the purposes of this post. Let's hope that we don't have to wait too long to get the answers. Now I'd like to summarize the languages that may have come from the steppe. If the existence of this language family can be confirmed, it would become a very interesting and important subject for the study of European linguistic history. The fact that linguists can now know with certainty that all of Northern and Western Europe was repopulated by newcomers from the steppe between 3000 to 2300 BC, and therefore that all of that area can have one and only one substrate common to all the area is an amazing step to finally be able to study the substrates of Europe in a scientific and coherent way. Here is a list of the more likely candidates to be part of this proposed North Eurasian Bronze Age language family. Basque Aquitanian greater than 95% probability. Iberian greater than 95% probability. Tartessian, if not a Celtic language, then 95% probability. If Celtic, then it's Celtic. I could mention Pictish in this same category, though Pictish has much more chances of being a Celtic language. Etruscan, 60% probability. Further ADNA samples won't tell us more than what we already know, so it's essentially a linguistic issue. Hurrian, 60 to 70% as it stands now, but getting the right samples from ancient DNA would confirm it or deny it with almost 100% certainty either way. Eurasian would be linked to the outcome of Hurrian. Northeast Caucasian, around 50% chances. It depends a lot on the outcome of Hurrian. Northwest Caucasian, unknown probability. It's strictly a linguistic issue, largely about it being related to Northeast Caucasian or not. Uralic languages, around 50% chances. See the Appendix I for some insights into the matter. Paleo-Sardinian, poorly attested. It's again a linguistic issue where ADNA has already told us it's at least possible. Probability around 30%. Finally, I'd like to stress that this post is in no way intended to be particularly complete nor a definitive solution to the problems it tries to address. As the title says, this is an alternative view of the evidence we have so far, and my hope is that it can serve as a framework for linguists interested in Indo European languages or European languages to be able to better understand the data that is available and decide to what extent they agree with one view or another, as well as serving as a way to assess future ancient DNA studies with some of the ideas and predictions contained here to see how they fit with either view. And thus ends the blog post. Thank you for those who have watched all the way. I hope it was at least interesting to hear this alternative theory, even if you don't currently agree. In the future, I will do a shorter video outlining the hypothesis and how you would approach disproving it if you wish to. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more videos like this.